This video has some tips and tricks to speed up your last layer solutions on your Megaminx. Okay, so this first tip is pretty straightforward, and it's something that you should be familiar with in solving the 3x3, and that is either partial or full edge orientation during your last pair. So let's say we have a case like this, and we solve it and insert it like that, and whilst we were doing that, there was only one last layer edge oriented. Instead, what we can do to give ourselves 3 edges oriented, because having only one last layer edge oriented is not a particularly nice case for edge orientation, what we can do is pair these two up and insert them using a sledgehammer, so R'F, R'F', and that way we get 2 more additional edges oriented, and we can have a slightly easier case for our edge orientation whilst we're solving the last layer. So that is, we only have these 2 to orient rather than 4 edges. Another tip which may be a little bit useful is to use alternative edge orientation algorithms to orient as many corners as possible whilst we orient edges. So let's say we've got these 2 edges misoriented, and what we need to be aware of now is that doing F, U, R, U', R', F' actually changes the orientation of these 2 corners. So if we were to do F, U, R, U', R', F' like that, then now we're in a situation where we have 5 corners misoriented, and these cases are a little bit more difficult to recognize and execute than most of the other corner orientation cases. So they're relatively less desirable. So let's go back to this position. What we can do is instead do something like R', U', F', U, F, R, like that. And what that does is changes the orientation of these 2 corners and preserves this corner's orientation. And if we notice, the thing to notice here is that if the corner sticker is facing the front here or here, then it will become oriented when we do R', U', F', U, F, R. So in this situation, we now get 2 corners oriented on our top layer, and we have a really easy case to recognize and execute to orient the rest of our last layer. Another common sense tip is to always check out alternative algorithms for solving last layer cases on your Megaminx, because it may be the case that, the algorithms that I provide or the ones that I use aren't particularly suitable for you and your finger tricks. And for many cases, there are alternative algorithms which are also quite fast. Unlike on the 3x3 cube, you will likely need to rotate around the y-axis in order to solve both your EPLL and CPLL, so that is your edge and corner permutation of the last layer, simply because of the increased recognition difficulty. So here, for example, I can do a U2 to solve these 2 edges, and without seeing that these 2 edges are solved, it can be kind of tricky to identify that these 2 edges are solved correctly relative to one another from this position and execute our edge permutation, which is already offset. So what it's probably easier to do for recognition is to solve these 2 like that and then go ahead and permute them like so. So this is again true for solving the corner permutation. So most of the corner permutation algorithms actually preserve the edges, so that is, there won't be any AUF after those algorithms. And in cases such as these, doing a U, then for example your algorithm which swaps these 2 and these 2, and then a U' afterwards is probably a little bit slower than actually rotating to help you identify the case more easily, and then going ahead and doing the algorithm and then not having to do any U or U' afterwards. But again, this is something that you can test out. So you can, do an average of 12, where the first thing that you do in an average of 12 is to do a U and then the algorithm and then a U'. So do an average of 12 of that and see what sort of times you get, and then do an average of 12 where you start out with the corner permutation in this position, do a rotation, and then solve it and see what sort of times you get on that. And from that you'll be able to determine which of those possibilities is fastest for you. That being said, during the orientation of your last layer, you shouldn't really need to rotate because you don't need to do any AUFs after the OLL. So yeah, you shouldn't be rotating during your OLL. Your goal after this should be to get to a point where you're very comfortable using for-loop last layer algorithms. The hardest ones are definitely the 5 corner cycles, and it's definitely okay to keep using commutators for a very long time, because an algorithm for solving 5 corners will only really save probably a second or so on average. But the 4 corner cycle algorithms and 3 corner cycle algorithms are really good for CPLL. In the next video, I'll talk a little bit about the sorts of things that you can do beyond learning for loop last layer algorithms.